name is Clare Montague, and I'm CEO of a business called Poppy's Funerals. And Nick has asked me to do a session on funerals and funeral planning in the context of end of life. So I'm just going to talk a bit about funerals and hopefully go through some things that you may know, didn't know, and what are the things that if you're thinking about planning towards the end of life, you might need to know. So one of the things I've put this slide up because I think one of the things that is interesting about funerals compared to other things that we spend money on, particularly these days, is I think our expectations of a funeral, we don't have very much expectation of funeral. We don't know how to, we've never bought a funeral until we actually need to do it. There's a sense that somehow all funerals are kind of the same and they're sort of black and somewhat gloomy, and also that all funeral directors are the same. And it's one of those things that if you think about spending quite a lot of money on a telly, for example, you do a bit of shopping around and looking online sort of comparator sites. And what's really striking, I think, with the way that people buy funerals is that we just sort of think, gosh, there's a funeral director down the road by Sainsbury's, that'll do, I'll just sort of pop in there. And I think one of the things we always say to people who are coming to us, or people who think they are wanting a funeral either imminently or in the next few weeks and months, is always shop around. It may feel like funeral directors are all the same, but they're not. And I think some will sell packages and those work for some people, but for others, you're being sold a package that involves a couple of limousines to take you to the funeral venue, and actually you can get there yourself under your own steam, and why would you be paying for it? So the first thing I would always say when you're thinking about funerals and funeral directors, particularly if you're thinking about planning in advance, is always is to shop around. And for those of you who are physically here, I have given out, we call it a guide to great death care. It's also been named on our website as Funeral Planning, a Simple Guide. And one of the reasons that we do that is to help you think about what are the things that you might need to know before you go and need a funeral. Because the more time you have, as always, to think about these things, the better. So not all funeral directors look like that. That's us. So Poppy's Funerals is different. So we say we're modern funeral directors, giving great care for the living and the dead. And we were set up 13 years ago, in 2012, in response to actually some of the bad practice that I think sadly we see too often in the funeral sector. So you may remember that there was a scandal last year in Hull with a funeral director that was not looking after the dead well. And there have been repeated exposés of how the funeral sector looks after both the dead, but also how it looks after the living. So repeated exposés, not quite as bad as the Hull scandal, but along those lines. And also the sector has had a reputation for quite exploitative pricing practices. Here's our cheapest coffin, but if you really loved your mum, this is our most expensive casket. And they've actually had been investigated by the Competition and Markets Authority because of that. One of the things we can talk about in the context of questions is the funeral sector is not regulated in this country. And so partly it's not regulated at all. You could put fridges in your back garden and call yourself a funeral director. So we were set up actually because we want to do funerals in a different and better way. I mean, what we do is not rocket science. We give great care for the living and for the dead. So we put the grieving person at the heart of the experience and say, what matters to you? We don't try and flog you a package. And we take huge pride in the way that we look after the dead in our care. And those two pictures that I put on the screen are of two of my colleagues. On the right is Poppy, who is the original Poppy who set up the business. And on the left is one of our funeral directors, Hannah, and they're working in our mortuary space. And we're very proud of our mortuary space because it's about how we showcase how we look after people. When you get people like me turning up as your funeral director, what is it that we actually do? And again, generally, you need to call a funeral director, but why would you know what it is we do? So funeral directors, we collect the person who's died and we care for them in our own mortuary. And the pictures that I put up on the screen are of the mortuary that we use. Our mortuary we're based in Lambeth Cemetery, so in Tooting, near St George's. We serve the whole of Greater London, so we look after people actually beyond Greater London. But the building on the left is a converted chapel. And it's really important to us that we look after people who died in a really beautiful, light, airy space that feels warm and welcoming, both to the people who are working in our mortuary and also to our wider community. And then the person on the right, Graham, is lining a coffin, and you can see again that's in our mortuary space. It's got light, natural light, windows, some wood paneling, and refrigeration on the side. So we look after the dead. And we collect the person who's died. We help family and friends arrange the funeral. That will be whether you want a burial or a cremation, where, when, how to commemorate the person, what kind of ceremony. And we also do a lot of liaison with other agencies. So that might be the coroner, or it might be a medical examiner, or so on. So we generally work sort of for about 3 weeks. Generally sort of we can do funerals much more quickly if that's what people want, but the sort of average that someone is with us for 3 weeks. And the most important thing for us is that our clients feel held and supported for the duration of time that they're with us. And I think one of the things that we always say is every funeral, every family is different, every funeral is different. And so when you are thinking about what kind of funeral director you might want, either for someone you know, or if you're organising your own funeral, is really make sure that you get a funeral director who understands what you want and doesn't try and flog you stuff that you don't want or need. And our job is, most people haven't organised a funeral before they come to us. So our job is to stand alongside them and help them through that process. So some things I thought would be helpful to go through about funerals and funeral planning. And I'm guessing that some of you may have had experience of organising a funeral before, but some of you may not have done. And I thought I'd just go through some of the main things that people assume about funerals. So the first thing to say on the top left is that there are no laws about how you do a funeral. And this speaks to the regulation point. So weirdly, and for all sorts of historical reasons, there is very little legislation around funerals at all. There are laws around registering someone's death within 5 days. And there are laws around ensuring that the person after they've died is buried or cremated. But there are no laws at all about what happens in between that. There is no regulation of funeral directors, and I think there should be. I think regulation in and of itself doesn't raise standards, but it's a really important start. And it's certainly something we feel very strongly about, that good care should be a basic minimum, and it's sadly not a lot of the times. But there are good things about there being no laws about how you do funeral. It means you have a lot of freedom and flexibility if that's what you want, to design a ceremony that is right for you. So you don't even have to use a funeral director. You certainly don't have to use a hearse. If you've got a big enough car, we have some people carriers that we use for people who don't want to use a traditional hearse. So the good thing about there being no laws is you have a lot of flexibility. The bad thing is, as you say, sir, is that there is no regulation. So no laws. I think one of the most important things, particularly for people if they die at home, is you can take your time. Decisions don't have to be taken in a hurry. And one of the reasons we say this is because after someone dies at home, the death needs to be verified. And typically that's the GP, you'd call a GP and they would come and say, or it can be a district nurse, it can be anyone clinical does some visual checks to check that the person has died. Quite often what we get is families who say to us that the GP, once they've come and verified the death, say, you now need to phone the funeral director immediately. You need to, it's really important, you phone the funeral director immediately. And again, for some families, that's absolutely right. They want the person, that they're ready for that person to leave. For others, they want a bit more time. And part of what we do is where people want to spend time with the person who's died at home after they've died is to support them and give them advice about how to look after someone. And that might be because people are coming, someone's coming home after, is a relative or a friend is coming over, or for whatever reason, they just want to spend time with someone after they've died. Funerals don't have to be expensive. So the average funeral cost in London is expensive. It's £5,000. But there are heaps of ways that you can make funerals more affordable. And we can go on to talk about that. Green funerals can be affordable too. Again, there's a perception that environmental funerals are expensive options. Embalming is a technique that actually goes back to ancient Egyptian times, is used to preserve someone who has died, so to slow down the natural process of deterioration after death. And many funeral directors, not all, will recommend that you embalm someone after they've died. And it is one of the reasons they do that is because their method of, if you want to visit someone after they've died in their chapel, in the funeral directors, what they call chapel of rest, we call it a different thing, we call it a visiting room, is that person would be out of refrigeration for some time, and so the funeral director recommends embalming. Now, actually, we say you don't need to be embalmed. The only circumstances under which you would ever need to be embalmed is if you're being repatriated. So either you're coming back, you've died overseas and you're coming back to the UK, or you've died in the UK and for whatever reason being flown back to another country to be buried. You would need to be embalmed then. But embalming, and again, I can talk about it a bit more if you're interested, but embalming is a fairly invasive procedure, and it never be told that you have to embalm someone, because it's just not true. And then the piece that I was saying at the beginning, which is that, it is worth shopping around for the right funeral director. Not all funeral directors are the same. And just as you would want to make sure that if you were seeking a professional carer for someone, or if you were looking for anything for someone that you loved, you can find the right person who will look after the person who's died. So kind of what are your options about thinking about a funeral? And the answer is, sort of going back to the fact that there's no laws, is that there really is no set template at all. And so anything is possible in terms of thinking about how someone could be commemorated. So we always start off with your values. What matters to you in life? You can have a religious service, you can have a non-religious service, you can have a blend. What are your traditions? What's your cultural affinity? So, for example, in my case, my dad is Jewish, but I have never known him enter a synagogue in my entire life. But I could not commemorate my dad without recognizing that he was the biggest Yiddish apopa ever. So when he dies, hopefully not soon, but he's quite old, we will have to have some kind of Jewish component to his funeral. But it wouldn't be right for us to go and have a proper Jewish funeral, because he's certainly not observant. And there are absolutely ways to be able to blend your kind of heritage with the reality of your lived experience at the time. You can do almost anything in terms of music or words or personal touches. We had someone who who had a very traditional funeral, but he worked for Cadbury's for 30 years, and his family put little dairy milks on everyone's seat. Or we've had, football supporters who are, I don't know, Chelsea supporters, and everyone wears blue. We've had all sorts, and the pictures that I've put up on the screen just give a range of different things that you can have. So this big picture on the right is actually, it's a really traditional coffin, but it's been decorated with pictures that the grandchildren have done. In the two middle pictures, the top one, again, super traditional, very old school Daimler hearse with a piper in the rain, obviously, and then a rainbow coffin for someone who identified as LGBTQ. And then in the top left, you've got a camper van hearse, again, for someone who is a very keen camper. And in the bottom left, you've got horse and carriage, very, very traditional, but with some nice yellow plumes to cheer you up a bit. And the answer is you can do almost anything for a funeral. You don't have to have an off-the-shelf traditional black, although equally, if that's what you want, you can do that too. So I thought I'd talk a bit about direct cremations and funeral plans and affordable funerals. Okay, so a direct cremation they became much, much more popular during the pandemic, or much more prevalent, I should say, during the pandemic, rather than popular. because people couldn't go to funerals, or no more than 6 people could go to funerals. And what they are is they're an unattended ceremony. So generally what happens is they're much cheaper. So they're about £1,000. They're quite often organised online. Not always. Most funeral directors will also offer a direct cremation package. And what happens is the person is taken to the crematorium, and they are then, and there's no one present at the crematorium, there's no service alongside the person, and then the ashes are usually returned, or you pick up the ashes separately. And for some people, they're really important because you separate out a celebration of life from the management of the body. For some people, they really appeal to my paternal grandparents died 30 years ago, and they actively asked for they didn't want anyone to come to their funeral, so they asked for they asked just for themselves to be cremated with no one there, and there was no product such as direct cremation, and that's what my dad and his sisters organised. I was very sad because I loved my grandparents, but that was what they wanted. And the reason I thought I'd talk a bit about them is that they really work for some people. They're really important for some people who've said, just put me in a skip. I don't want a huge amount of ceremony. And that's really important, where the person who wants to go into skip has also talked to their family about it. Where there are difficulties with direct cremations, which we've had experience of, is where people have said, not only do they want a direct cremation, but they might have organised a funeral plan to pay for a direct cremation. And the family have said, yeah, but actually we want to have a ceremony. This is not how we want to remember our person. And I worry a bit about direct cremations where they're seen as the only affordable option, because they're not, because funerals are more expensive. And I worry a bit about direct cremations when people haven't talked to their family and friends about what they want. And one of the things we always say as part of these kinds of conversations is the most important thing is to talk to your family and friends about what you want. And I think there is quite a lot on daytime TV about pushing direct cremations and linking that to a funeral plan. And a funeral plan is a financial product where you pay for a funeral up front, or over a series of installments, so that the estate or your family don't have to worry about it. And again, that's good and important for some people. I mean, it's about 20% of funerals in England are direct cremations, so the vast majority is still attended. But you're absolutely right. Companies like Pure Cremation have a very high budget to spend a lot of money on advertising on television, and it's very often linked to a funeral plan as well, so that you pay up front, and it's marketed as a separation of, your family and friends can get on with the celebration of life separately. But there are, and again, I can talk a bit about this in questions if you're interested, there are loads of ways in which you can have a funeral that is affordable, that doesn't cost the earth. And there is actually also financial help out there. There are charity and government options, particularly for those who are on benefits, for help with funerals. So it isn't the only affordable option. So there are ways to limit or minimize, the impact of your environmental footprint, because this sector can be quite hefty in terms of an impact on the planet. So the most environmentally friendly sort of funeral type is to have a natural burial rather than a cremation or going to a traditional burial ground. So a natural burial grounds are usually outside of London, and they are areas that are aimed at preserving wildlife and promoting sort of biodiversity. And so you're not allowed to have any plastic, or you're not allowed to be embalmed, and you tend to be buried at a shallower level so that you return to the earth more quickly, and that they promote sort of, as I say, environmentally sort of biodiverse sort of environment. If you want a sort of green funeral, we would always say you don't embalm, is that the chemicals that they use in embalming are pretty environmentally harmful. There are ways to have flowers and options that are locally grown or seasonal, or you can grow your own or pick your own flowers. You don't have to go to a florist. We've had people who've put vegetables from their allotment on the top of a coffin. So there are all sorts of ways in which you can reduce your footprint. You use public transport and perhaps use an electric hearse. And I think also, as always with these things, if this is what matters to you, think about whether or not you need a printed printed materials, think about what you actually want or need at the ceremony. And then sort of the last piece really is around planning your own funeral or planning a funeral for someone who is close to you. So one of the things that we always say is the more that you can get planning on your wishes and talking to other people about what you might want, the better. And particularly the earlier. We see an awful lot of people coming to us, someone's died, they haven't had a conversation with the person who's died about what they would have wanted. There's quite a lot of, I don't know what mum would have wanted, or worse still, conflict in the family with two different versions about what mum would have wanted. And so one of the things that we offer, and I've got some cards for those of you who come a bit later, is a free consultation to talk about your funeral wishes, because what we say is actually the most important thing is to start having the conversation. It makes a huge difference for people to know what you would have wanted and what you don't want. So there will be some things that matter hugely to you. It might be hugely important that the faith that you were born in was recognized or not, or it might be hugely important to you that you have a very upbeat kind of tone and that you have particular songs played or not. And sometimes it's just really helpful for people to know, this is what I mind about and this is what I don't mind. Make some decisions yourself. I have very strong views about having very upbeat music at my funeral, but I don't care an awful lot about some, what words you want to say and that kind of thing. So I think just having some thoughts about what you would have wanted, having the opportunity to talk about it is really, really important. And as I said, we offer a free consultation that if you wanted to take us up on that, which actually gives you a sort of PDF, a set of sort of a written document that you could then use to talk to your family and friends about what you might want. And that's really my lot. So that's just, I've put up on the screen some more resources. So as I said, we offer a funeral wishes consultation. I've also handed out for people who are here, our guide to great death care, which is about giving you, I think, hopefully describing some of the ways in which you might shop around for a funeral director and some questions to think about, questions to ask a funeral director when you get to the point of thinking about planning a funeral. We also have a blog, which has heaps of guidance and advice on our website. We're always happy to take questions. The technical position around ash scattering is you need landowner permission to scatter ashes. There will be certain places, parks, particularly where we would say, yeah, don't tell us, but go and do your thing, because technically you should get permission before you go around scattering. But yeah, it is very common that it's very difficult for family members to talk about it, and it can go both ways. It can be a child that wants to talk to an elderly parent about, and the elderly parent doesn't want to engage. It can go between husband and wife. I had someone come into our shop in Sheen whose husband is terminally ill, and she knows that they're going to have to organise a funeral, and he won't engage in that conversation either. So what you describe is very common, and the thing we always say is you've clearly got it very sort of sorted and you've got a briefcase. We always just say write it down and tell them that there is where to find it. So at the point at which they have to engage, even if they don't want to, there is something written down that says, I want this, this, and this, but not this. I think quite quickly a skip. I mean, what is interesting, I find, is you are right to say that there is more humour now in funerals than there has been. And one of the things that is very striking is most people still want a very traditional funeral. One of the things I find most fascinating about death, and my previous job was I worked at a hospice before coming here. So I've been over 10 years in this kind of world. One of the things that is fascinating is that there are about as many different attitudes to death as there are people. And there are absolutely people for whom after death that has no meaning. And so therefore for a skip, but the metaphor of a skip is absolutely, or the humor and the sort of is absolutely appropriate. I'm always struck by the number of people that we look after, and we're very modern funeral directors. I mean, you can see we've got orange branding, and actually I'm looking quite dark today, but we don't turn up in black. But the vast majority of our clients still prefer something fairly traditional and want a ritual around someone's died. And the other thing I always think is interesting is I come from a very rationalist family, so there is no way on God's earth I can imagine either of my parents wanting to see the other and visit after they've died. But over 50% of our clients choose to visit someone after they've died. And there is that very strong sense of taking this ritual very seriously. And I think the most important thing that any funeral director can do is support you, whether you are a skip person or a trad person or a visit person or whatever it else is in between. The most important thing goes back to there are as many different attitudes towards death as there are people. And what is your or your family's or your friends or whoever it is attitude to this? And what do you need? And making sure that the funeral director you get meets those needs and doesn't try and flog something to you that you don't want or need, because that's no good for anyone. Part of the fact that the funeral sector has had not a great reputation, both in terms of how it looks after the dead and indeed how it talks to the living and trying to, rip you off with whatever expensive stuff, is that it's also a sector that hasn't had much scrutiny, because that in turn reflects our fear of death. Because we don't generally want to think about what happens after someone dies. We don't really want to think about whether this funeral director is better than that funeral director, or what is it that you're actually doing. So there's a sort of confluence of, this is not something I want to do. This is not something I want to think about. I only do this once and twice. Generally, I just want to get this out of the way because this is all going to be and what is really sad to me is that our expectations, shaped by a funeral sector that's not good enough, are generally, this is all going to be quite grim. And it starts with a funeral director sort of that's, I don't know, got some memorial headstones in the window and grubby neck curtains and feels like a place that, and the people are very nice, but it's all a bit shabby. It's not a particularly nice experience. And then there's the point at which they pull out the drawer and they say, which coffin handle do you want? And you're just like, oh God, really? And I think that's, that is a reflection of how we think about, or our inability to think or talk about death. The sort of taking your time is the ideal scenario, where you have someone who dies at home and it's a relatively smooth process, where you have got, bureaucracy involved. It takes longer. Yes, absolutely. So there are heaps of people out there. Have you heard of celebrants? Yeah, so celebrants are people, and they can be really sort of humanist, which means they don't do any religion at all, or some of them are a bit more comfortable blending religion with non-religion. But absolutely, all funeral directors will have celebrants that they know, and again, they will work a bit differently. So some of the trad funeral directors will just have like 5 people that they kind of have on speed dial. We work a bit differently. We try and match a celebrant to the family. So sometimes the family wants someone, they may want someone who is, I don't know, they may want a woman, they want a man, they may want someone who's got, we see that the family has got, it would be really good to get someone with a particular interest. So for example, we have a celebrant on our books who used to work at a homelessness charity. And when we were asked to source a celebrant for a young man on behalf of a family of a young man who died, who spent a long time homeless, we'd actually got in touch with this guy because he had some previous experience working with homelessness. So and what we usually do is we give a couple of recommendations to the family and get them to meet the celebrant to make sure that they feel that the celebrant is going to represent the person well. So again, that's part of, if a celebrant is important to you at the point at which you're then thinking about a funeral, it's really important to make sure that you feel that you've got access through the funeral director to someone who is going to represent the person who's died well. The other thing, depending on who's in your circle, is you can also do it yourself. You can MC a funeral, and some people are not always comfortable with that. The advantage of a celebrant is that they tend to be able to, they don't have the personal skin in the game, and sometimes it can be just too much for the family to do that. If someone dies without money, or without families that can, or with families who can't afford to pay for a funeral, then the old term was pauper's funeral, it's now called public health funerals, but the obligation is on the local authority to organise the funeral. And so there are, so the if you have literally no money, you can't afford it, you don't have any, or you're homeless, or there's just no one around in your circle who can who can organise a funeral, the default would be that it was then, the funeral would be arranged and paid for by the local authority. So in this case, obviously Sutton. And each local authority will do it somewhat differently, but it's usually a very, very simple coffin. There may or may not be a minister or a person present to say a few words, and it may or may not be. The other thing is that depending on the policy of the local authority, they may or may not notify family members of who. So in the circumstances where someone has died and the family is known but don't have the resources to pay, they may or may not notify that the burial or the cremation is taking place. So the reality is, if someone dies without resources, it's the local authority's responsibility to make that work, and they will have a contract with a local funeral director who will come and collect the person and care for them while they organise the public health funeral. There are, for people who have some resources but not much, and particularly for those who are on benefits, you can stitch together, but it is stitching together because it's benefits and it's government help. So support. So there is the DWP for people who are means tested benefits will provide access to funeral to support for a funeral up to I can't remember how much it is. I think it's about 1,000. It's not much. It wouldn't pay for a full cost of a funeral. There are charities. There's Quaker Social Action that will pay for that have some grants, and then there are also some debt sort of repayment schedules. There's one called Funeral Safe, I think, that would also be able to support someone. But it's really hard if you've not got money, and that's why I say actually one of the most important things is going and talking to someone about what it is you want and what matters to you, because actually if it's important to you to have an attended funeral, it is hard. If it's a public health funeral, there's really very little anyone can do. But if you're stitching together a funeral on low resources, you can, with support from a good funeral director, put something together. So in the circumstances where it's genuinely public health funeral, you'll have to go through the council for that. And you know, rightly or wrongly, funerals in this country are run as private businesses, and you know, we are a good, fabulous, caring, compassionate B Corp business, but we are also run as a commercial business. So we wouldn't take someone who was a public health funeral. But if there were some resources and you had a family member who was able to pay, and you had or some of it, and you also had access to DWP funds, then you could absolutely work with a good funeral director to create a funeral that was much lower cost than what you'd expect based on the averages. But public health is public health, I'm afraid. You can choose wherever you want to go. Okay, so there are two parts to that. So it's ashes going somewhere and body going somewhere. So there are companies that specialize, so it's called repatriation, whichever direction you're going in. And there are companies that specialize in repatriation. And if you're burying the person, what would generally happen, you might want to, there are two different ways of doing it. You'd either potentially have a funeral here and then transport the person after the funeral to their homeland, or you might, at the point at which they die, want to transport them completely over to their homeland and do the funeral and the ceremony over there. In both cases, there is a specialist service that you'd need to use to organise that, and those are the circumstances under which you would need to embalm a person, because you go into a sort of hermetically sealed coffin, and it is run through cargo. It's not particularly pleasant, but it's run through cargo at Heathrow. So there are specialist companies that will help with transporting someone who's died. In terms of ashes, this is one where we would say it's not a don't ask, don't. Well, it slightly depends where you're taking the ashes to and how you're transporting. It is always a good idea to have find out what the policy is of the country to which you are going, and to have some documentation, and to carry it in your hand luggage is always the thing that we say. So there are, and again, there are different rules in different countries. So for example, one of the things that we do for families that where it's important is where you have ashes, is we do what we call transfer of ashes, and we might split the ashes if, say, there are 2 or 3 children. So in my case, my grandmother died 10 years ago. She had 5 children. We asked, in fact, Poppy's did her funeral. We had 5 different scatter tubes, and each child got an opportunity to scatter her in different places, which was fabulous for everyone, except that one of my aunts lives in France, and in France you have to retain the whole body. You can't, even the ashes, you can't split the ashes. So that was so in fact she couldn't scatter her mum in France. Possibly with hindsight, you might have done a bit of a don't ask, don't tell, and see if you could get away with it on the Eurostar. But you have to be super careful when you are going through scanners. If you're carrying ashes, it will look odd. Someone will start asking questions. You need to find out what the sort of receiving country rules are. And clearly, you know, if, say, your homeland, if you were driving, I don't know, across Europe to Poland, for example, you could probably manage that on the don't ask, don't tell. But if you're getting anywhere on a plane, I think you would, yeah, you'd probably just want to make sure that you have documentation, because at some point someone is going to go, what's this? And I mean, I've had a story of a colleague who scattered her brother at the top of Kilimanjaro, and even though she had all the paperwork right, you know, they got very het up in, is it Tanzania, about what this sort of thing was, and it was only when they finally explained that actually it was the ashes of their pets, they went, oh God, and ran a mile. But you know, you need to make sure that you've got your documentation sorted. Now, funeral plans are regulated. So it's a regulated financial services product, just like insurance or pensions or everything else, which is good. However, historically, until 2022, the funeral plans were not regulated. And so, again, as elsewhere in the funeral sector, there was some very nasty scandals. A few years ago, there was a company called Safe Hands and another one whose name I forget, where they were not pucker and they went bust and people lost their money. So assuming it's all gone well and you've got a funeral plan that you've bought where you've saved your money into your plan, your plan will, it's like any other insurance policy, it will pay for whatever it is you've specified as part of the plan. So I don't know, a cremation, a particular kind of coffin, maybe some flowers, whatever it is you've decided. And then at the point at which you die, your descendant, whoever is organising the funeral, will need to go to a funeral. And it may be that the funeral plan is organised through a funeral director, or that it may be an independent financial services product. But you need to make sure that whoever is left knows that you have a funeral plan, knows what the arrangements are, whether you phone someone or whether you can take it into a local funeral director. It will depend on what the plan says. And then effectively you cash it in. So what happens is then we only started selling funeral plans 4 years ago because of the history of the products, actually, and we didn't think that they were good enough, and we only started selling them just before they started getting regulated. And we've just had our first funeral from a first funeral plan that we sold 4 years ago. And so this chap put some money aside, and then when he died, his family got in touch with us and said, this chap has got a funeral plan with you. And we said, yeah, great. And so we now provide the funeral, and so there won't be any bill to his family because he's already paid for it up front.